further ado, I'm going to start the introduction for Brad Howe. He is the design director of SCAPE Studio. Brad received a bachelor's in science with distinction from the University of Nebraska, and then went on to receive a master's in landscape architecture from the Graduate School of Design at Harvard University. At SCAPE, he leads design teams for a number of large-scale waterfront and resilience planning projects. He focuses on creating ecologically vibrant waterfronts and public spaces, from complex, large-scale planning projects with extensive engagement to detailed site design. That is to say, Brad works to integrate natural cycles and systems, the natural world, into urban landscapes and urban environments across all scales. He has been a part of some of the most inspiring projects in the past decade, including the much talked about Living Breakwaters project of Staten Island. This much awarded project has constructed stone breakwaters that simultaneously restore hundreds of millions of oysters to the mouth of the Raritan Bay, which clean the water. Each oyster siphons about 50 gallons a day. It protects and restores the coastline from erosion, provides new offshore habitat for marine life, creates buy-in and ownership from the local community, and even gets children involved in the coastline restoration with educational programs. Natural cycles, urban landscapes, ecology, climate change risk reduction, and cultural reinforcement are all addressed in one elegant project. And you see this replicated in a lot of their projects. This is just one example of the caliber of work that's done at SCAPE. And I'm gonna stop there with any other projects, as I want to hear from him. He is also an adjunct professor in landscape architecture at City College of New York. He co-teaches with our previous guest from this semester, Catherine Sievert-Nordenson. So yeah, I'll waste no more time. We're thrilled to have you. Thank you so much, Brad Howe. Let's give a round of applause.
Thank you. All right, so I will share my screen. And I hope everything's showing up full screen. Can everybody hear me okay?
Hold on one moment. I'm gonna get you on the speakers. Okay. Let's see. Can you give us a test? Hello?
Test, hello.
Excellent. We can hear you. Okay, take it away. Thanks, Brad.
All right, well, thank you. And thank you for that amazing introduction. You did a lot of work for me. That's on this slide that I have here. But I wanted to introduce myself first. I'm a design director at SCAPE, a landscape architect, primarily focused on a lot of our waterfront resilience work, but also spend my time teaching, educating, and in my spare time making. So a little bit about SCAPE. We have 3 offices across the United States, an office in New York City, an office in New Orleans, and an office in San Francisco. And we are an office comprised of landscape architects, urban designers, urban planners, and horticulturalists. And this kind of like multifaceted skill set in an office really allows us to think at multiple scales and take a really multidisciplinary approach to design. And through an expression of landscape at those multiple scales, ranging from anything from an small urban plaza to a master plan at the scale of a watershed in a 100-mile river corridor. And so through that work, we really seek to revive landscape systems, identify those systems and bring them to the foreground, forge connections between people and the ecology and their environment, generate new ecosystems, in thinking about what the kind of future of our urban ecology is, and embracing that physical reality through actually getting to the site, touching it, and experimenting, piloting, and engaging people in that process. And so there's a great introduction on living breakwaters, and so I'm going to share that project with you today. And I'm going to share one other, Tom Lee Park in Memphis. These are projects that are quite different. One is they're both situated on the waterfront. One is actually in the water, while the other one is along the water, and they're both in very different environments. One is coastal in Staten Island in New York City, and the other one is along the Mississippi River in Tennessee. But they do have some things in common. They're both landscapes that mitigate future risk, but in different ways. So with the living breakwaters, the idea is that this is a project that uses a blue-green infrastructure approach to mitigate coastal risk from future hurricanes, coastal erosion, and sea level rise. Whereas Tomley Park's much different. I think Memphis has a different set of challenges, and I think especially felt this summer with the incredible heat waves that really hit this region. And so this kind of emphasis and need on open space and shade and trees has really come to the forefront in this community. They're both modified landscapes in highly urbanized areas. So you can see these are two aerial images. One at the coast of Staten Island, the other here in Memphis. And so you can see how different they are, but both incredibly urban. And they both have ecosystems and species that are struggling to keep up with the pace of change. In Staten Island, the oyster, right? This is a species that was once prolific in the harbor and has now been nearly depleted. And there are large-scale restoration efforts looking to bring them back. And then in Tomley Park, the story is a little different, right? But it is located on the Mississippi Flyway, and that's a major flyway corridor for the monarch butterfly. And as you can see here from the New York Times, these were just recently listed as an endangered species. And in both cases, people are a critical participant in their urban ecology. So the image on the left shows a shore tour that we gave with some local students to kind of educate them about the risks of the shoreline at Staten Island and at the Living Breakwaters project area. And the other one is a group of participants in a volunteer program actually planting pollinator gardens in a site just adjacent to Tomley Park. So I'll start with Living Breakwaters. So this is just kind of contextualizing, located at the very southern tip of Staten Island in the New York Harbor. And this is just an aerial image, so you can see there's mostly single family homes located along a shoreline with a larger kind of public park at that southern tip. But this area has kind of experienced a lot of coastal erosion from exposure to storm wave damage, and received a lot of damage during Hurricane Sandy. So this is just in this black box here, you can see the different like land loss risks, the inundation in blue from Hurricane Sandy. And through that, obviously in 2012, 10 years ago, Hurricane Sandy hit New York Harbor. And this site in particular received a lot of destruction and damage. Homes were knocked off their foundations. Unfortunately, 2 people lost their lives in this neighborhood. And the kind of remnants of the erosion on the shoreline were really felt in this area too. You can see infrastructure being exposed along the beach. So a competition was launched called Rebuild by Design. This was a challenge to designers, thinkers, planners, architects, landscape architects to come up with, I guess, thoughts, ideas to address climate change, address these increasing risks of living in this area. And SCAPE led a team to, the first kind of step of that was to research these bay shallow areas in the region and come up with 5 or 6 proposals for a project. And out of that research phase, the Living Breakwaters project was selected to advance into the concept and competition phase. And so we assembled a team to do that. And the team grew. So once the project was awarded funding and actually won that concept and competition phase from Rebuild by Design, the Governor's Office of Storm Recovery in New York led the implementation of this. And SCAPE assembled a team of engineers, ecologists, nonprofit organizations, including the Billion Oyster Project, to really come together and make this project a reality. And so here's that first rendering, right? You can see this offshore series of breakwaters that are designed as a kind of integrated approach, an integrated approach to coastal risk reduction, habitat generation, and establishing a culture of resilience on the shoreline and educating people about coastal risk. So the project itself is more than just a living breakwater. It's a layered approach of different resilient solutions that creates this culture of resilience on the shoreline. And I'm going to start peppering in some construction photographs here because we're very excited that this project's moving through its construction phase, and it's nearing its halfway completion point. But you can see how this layered approach is starting to take shape. You have this onshore dune, a beach, this kind of calmer water between the beach and the breakwater, and then the habitat breakwater offshore that attenuates the storm waves and reduces the shoreline erosion. So in looking at those three parts, the risk reduction, the habitat creation, and the social resilience, the first point of living breakwaters is it's blue-green infrastructure that mitigates coastal risk. So living breakwaters build beaches, they reduce coastal erosion and kind of help build that beach back. And so you can see here, this is just a diagram that shows how we had to work pretty hard with our engineers to calibrate the distance of shore to make sure that we were getting the kind of salient response on the shoreline that we were looking for. Breakwaters attenuate storm waves, but they do not keep floodwaters out. And this is really an important concept in the kind of overall narrative of adaptation, is that there's no kind of one solution to fit everything, and that there really needs to be a conversation about the risks associated with living on the shoreline, in identifying different coastal risks that projects can attenuate or mitigate in the process. And so here, the more risky kind of component of the shoreline is actually the exposure to the larger storm waves. And so the idea was that these living breakwaters can attenuate that risk. And we did that through a lot of coastal modeling. So we ran these through computational models with our engineers to evaluate the effectiveness in wave height reduction through these kind of computer simulations of wave environments. We had to model and test water circulation and flow to make sure that these structures weren't actually impeding the movement of water, and that the system was adequately kind of flushing out, essentially, so there's no stagnant water behind the breakwaters. And we even modeled these in a research facility. These are scale models of the breakwaters that were mocked up in a wave tank. And the waves were simulated to kind of monitor their both structural integrity of the design. So essentially, we put these under the ringer of a variety of different storm wave conditions to evaluate how they would perform. But also those monitors that you see in the water, those kind of tripods, those were monitoring wave height as well. So we were able to evaluate the height of the wave before it reached the structure and the height of the wave after the waves were knocked down by the structure. And you can see them here starting to get constructed. So these are the footprints of two breakwaters. They're called marine mattresses. They are sort of the base layer of the structures. And then here they are kind of emerging from the water. You can see those, they almost look like little pork chops, but I'll talk about those in a second. But those are actually precast concrete tide pools that create more habitat in the structure, and also are substitutes for the armor stone or the rocks in the breakwater itself. I mean, this is just an image kind of looking out. You can see it back there, that's the crane barge that actually assists with individually placing stones from a barge onto these structures. So the second part, the living breakwaters are designed to create habitat. And they're designed in multiple ways to do that. So here, this is kind of like the integrated rendering of the structure. You can see there's actual structural modifications to a typical breakwater segment. Here, what we call them are reef ridges. They're essentially these protrusions that reach off that main breakwater trunk that provide smaller niche spaces for young fish to kind of like retreat in the rock pores and then move out into those open reef streets and feed in the streets. So there's the pore spaces for fish. There are the e-concrete armor units and e-concrete tide pools. These are actually precast elements that they function structurally within the rubble mound structure, but they've been precast with concrete that's specifically mixed with an admixture that specifically targets biological growth and promotes biological growth on the concrete structure. And then of course, there's room for other kind of critters to roost on the top of them as well, including seals. So here, this is just kind of showing how the different pore spaces provide those different types of habitat spaces, and different size spaces allow different species of fish to actually find refuge and find hiding places. So if it's all one consistent pore size, you're really only targeting one specific species. But by providing a complexity of different in a range of pore sizes, you're able to cater to a variety of different species that live in this area. The reef streets themselves are actually modeled off of naturally occurring structures and naturally occurring reefs. You can see how there's kind of like create these corridors of movement. And this allows fish to kind of find feeding ground, but also have a place to retreat to should they be in danger of predation. And this area was also, it's constructed in Tottenville, which is also known as the town that Oyster built. So a long time ago, this place had a thriving oyster economy, which has obviously since diminished. And the idea behind the living breakwater structure is to actually use them as a mechanism for oyster restoration in the Raritan Bay. And that can be done through multiple methods. And our partners at the Billion Oyster Project have been researching and piloting different techniques to evaluate their performance before they place them on the breakwaters. But it ranges from these like gabion structures and cages that have oysters seeded with larvae. The e-concrete units actually have attachments that can be placed on them. So they can be seeded with oyster larvae and then attached to the structure where oysters can grow. And then also just fundamentally, the living breakwaters provide more rocky structure. So as oyster larvae floats through the bay, they actually have something to settle and land on and accumulate. But to design good habitat, you have to understand what you're designing for. And so we did a lot of surveys. We had divers go out and look at rock piles in the area to see what was living there, what was growing on them, take samples of them, test them, bring them to a lab. And that allowed us to create a kind of target species matrix, which helped us design the right pore spaces to target the right species and design that habitat for animals that are actually living there. We had to kind of understand the sediment system. So we had in the sediment grain size. So we had people go out and take sediment, grab samples, test them, evaluate them in a lab. And then we translated that data into our computer models to be able to model shoreline change. And so this kind of shows all of those, how those structures work together. So ranging from a variety of stone sizes, the marine mattress, and those precast ecological concrete units kind of all come together to form this habitat structure that provides this like robust and kind of crazy underwater habitat life. And I think what we've found just in the installation of these few kind of concrete structures and breakwaters that have gone in now, things are already starting to move in, already starting to grow. We're seeing a lot of life in the tide pools. And we're also seeing some residents come in and hang out on the rocks. And so this was a pretty gratifying moment for us, I think, when we were able to compare a real life moment to the rendering and see it happen. So this is Stanley the seal. He has since not come back for a while, but we hope to see him again soon. And finally, we had to really pilot test and experiment. So this is just some video footage from that wave tank that I talked about earlier. You can see how these different sizes of waves were tested, crashing into that structure. The different colors of rocks actually are spray painted to correspond to the different rock sizes that are specified in the project. So we were able to track if a rock was dislodged, where it was dislodged from, and evaluate the design. These are some photographs from piloting some of the oyster restoration techniques and some of the results. So on the far left, you can see Danielle, she's actually holding one of those e-concrete oyster discs. That this is just a year of growth. So this is a great habitat for oysters. This was a previous natural environment, so they're quite happy here. So it's a great sign for the future of the living breakwaters. And finally, for that last part of building social resilience through education, the idea is to kind of create a culture of resilience at the shoreline through educating youth about coastal risk and about how the living breakwaters actually mitigate that coastal risk. So that's done through organizing oyster restoration volunteer events. You can see some student volunteers in the background helping. Just holding a variety of different community engagement events to actually just help kids understand the cross-section of the bay environment and what's living down there. And then actually bring people to the site, teach them about the dynamics of the site, and show them how the Living Breakwaters project will change that. And then finally, taking it to the classroom. So we've been working with the Billion Oyster Project to actually develop a curriculum that's based off the Living Breakwaters. And the idea is that high school STEAM teachers can download this and actually include Living Breakwaters and some of the Billion Oyster Project's oyster restoration efforts into their middle school curriculums. But now moving to the south a little bit and looking at Tomley Park. A very different context. Tomley Park's on the mighty Mississippi, which obviously through these like very beautiful Fisk maps is a difficult river to predict and also channelize, although despite some of the best efforts along the river. And I think for us, we were really inspired by that, inspired by the context of the park and inspired by the kind of meandering forms that the Mississippi River takes on in that region. And so you can kind of see that reflected in the design. But it's kind of in a weird place in terms of like how the site was created over time. And the history of this site is actually quite interesting. So this is just kind of contextualizing it. You've got Memphis, which is located up on a bluff. Tomley Park, which is actually at the base of that bluff and along the riverfront. And then across, you can see this kind of like dynamic floodplain of Arkansas. So that side of the river has not been hardened, essentially. And so you can see the kind of flood paths that the river takes through its seasons. Where on the Memphis side, it's expressed as more of a stark line. And the legacy of the Memphis riverfront was one of a very kind of like, the river was its front door. It was once a working waterfront, but with the rise of the automobile, this is actually a photo of the project site, the city kind of turned its back on the river and, sort of turned to the automobile, essentially. And over time, you can see how the kind of industrial character of it really diminished. The bluff and the shoreline experienced a lot of erosion. And so the Army Corps of Engineers came in and actually constructed Tomley Park as an erosion protection project for the bluff. And so it constructed a rock dike wall and filled that in with dredge material behind it. And so what it left in its wake is just a wide open lawn. That is called Tomley Park, but doesn't actually have a lot of kind of like open space amenities, and of course, like has no trees. So kind of created this like vast lawn with no space for really refuge or to find shade in the kind of hot Memphis summers. And despite its best effort, of the Army Corps, the Mississippi still floods. This is an image from 2011. And it was kind of one of the more significant flooding events that the site has experienced. I always find this photo really interesting because this is Tom Lee, who's the namesake of the park. Tom Lee was a Black man who rescued 32 drowning folks from a boat despite his inability to swim. So he basically mustered up the courage to rescue and save the lives of 32 people, got a boat and brought them to shore. And so this park was named for him. And what's interesting about the Memphis riverfront is it's really this common ground. It's a place for all Memphians. And so you can see in terms of the context of the space, 6 of the poorest zip codes in Tennessee are actually in the vicinity of the Memphis waterfront. But you can also see there are zip codes that are above the median household income. So there's a really kind of large transect of populations that live near the riverfront. And the idea is that this riverfront is that common ground for all people to kind of be at and enjoy. But it's not really accessible. The bluff kind of really cuts access from the city to its waterfront. So a big part of this project was kind of unlocking that access and bringing people to the water's edge through ADA accessible connections down the bluff. So it took a team to get there. We partnered with Studio Gang. So Studio Gang led the team of designers. We were the landscape architects on the project. There's a couple structures in the park that they designed, have been really great partners throughout the design construction process. And then of course it goes without saying, the Memphis River Parks partnership, huge in the kind of like fundraising for this, spearheading its implementation and making this park a reality. But we always kept coming back to this image of these meandering forms, the kind of dynamism of the Mississippi River, and really trying to translate that in mimicking that in the design. So in terms of kind of like setting up that structure, we first wanted to reinforce those urban connections, connect people that live on the bluff, down the bluff through ADA accessible entries to these kind of key landing points and entries. And then connecting those with a hierarchy of different path networks that really like stitch together a range of active park uses. And through that, we kind of had these different zones emerge that had different almost characters. There's the civic gateway, there's the active core, which is very playful, active, and fun. The community batcher, which is marked by topography and kind of more pensive park moments. There's a memorial sited there, an overlook, a picnic grove. And then finally, as the park kind of transitioned to this edge of the rock wall that had actually been collapsed, and the river had kind of taken it back a little bit and reclaimed that space, there was a lot of riparian habitat. And so the idea is to create these habitat education elements to really like bring people closer to the river's edge without getting them down to the water. Because I think, as you can imagine, the Mississippi is not a safe river for people to get close to or even dip their toes in, because its currents are so powerful. And so this is the rendering we showed that kind of shows those dynamic forms. And this is the park kind of in its middle of construction. So y'all are kind of getting a little bit of a sneak peek of 2 projects that are very much in the middle of their construction process. So I just thought I'd walk through each of the zones. So the Civic Gateway has kind of 2 major components. It has that ADA accessible walkway that connects the city that is up on top of the bluff down to the park, crossing the street to this almost civic water feature in plaza. These are just some renderings of the bluff and that plaza, and then you can kind of see them in process and in construction. So the idea here is to greet people from the north with a very kind of like civic space, providing paved areas for performances, for farmers markets, for different events, and while also like just simply planting trees for shade and creating a shaded grove right adjacent to that area. This is what we call the Cut Bank Bluff, which is that ADA accessible entry and pathway down the bluff. This is the active core. The idea here is this is sort of teaming with activity. We've collaborated with Monstrum for the design of a really unique and iconic playground. Studio Gang designed an incredible overhead civic canopy that that shades sport courts. There's 2 pavilions to support park programs, and then some smaller spaces to just sit, kind of enjoy the sunset over the river. You can see that civic canopy in the background here. And this is the plan of our playground, which has been designed and inspired by kind of this idea of life on the Mississippi. So the blue is kind of this reflection of the Mississippi, one of the Mississippi pathways in that Fisk map. And along that are some different kind of characters of the river or different wildlife that you might find at the edge. Including the river otter. So we collaborated with Monstrum to design basically this 22-foot tall river otter that kids can kind of climb in and play on, and it becomes an educational play structure. And this is an image from their shop. I think this is about to get installed probably in the next couple of weeks, and I think we're really excited to see all of that come together. The community bachelor is marked with a little bit with more, I don't want to say passive program, but more contemplative program, including that Tom Lee Memorial that I showed earlier that was kind of in that flooding condition. We've really celebrated that and given it kind of a special place. And it's also been supplemented with the work of artists at the Astor Gates, who we've collaborated with to create a site installation that creates a sort of walking experience through the park to tell the story of Tom Lee. And you can see that here. There's a point of reflection in that circular kind of place to be that connects to this, what we call the point of redemption, which is this moment of reckoning along the water's edge, and kind of a reminder of the heroism of Tom Lee. All the while that that procession and connection to that installation always has views back to the original Tom Lee Memorial statue. So it's always a reminder along that way of the risk that Tom Lee took to save these people. But the Bachelor also has like great topography. We really wanted to elevate people up off of that flat surface and give them different views of the river. And what was interesting about this particular project is that we were a little bit limited in what we could do because this is a huge erosion protection infrastructure project by the Army Corps. We weren't actually allowed to dig into the site. So we were only actually allowed to import fill in this case, because had we dug, we would have compromised the integrity of the cap, which basically keeps water from draining into that dredged material and creating pressure on the backside of that rock wall. And finally, the habitat terraces. So this area is really kind of, the idea behind this area is to really get people a little bit closer to the river, a little bit closer to the water's edge, really kind of engage with the natural wildlife and habitat of the place. Because the Memphis riverfront is habitat, despite its very urban location and its very kind of urban character. It very much is on the Mississippi River. It's on the Mississippi Flyway. And this is a place where many, many insects and many, many animals make their home. And so one thing that we thought a lot about was this location on the Flyway, and we thought about what different plants kind of have these host relationships with these different insects. So the milkweed for the monarch butterfly, but there's also this great story of the pawpaw and the zebra swallowtail. The zebra swallowtail larva really only eats the leaf of the pawpaw, and so there's this great kind of symbiotic relationship between the two. And so we really look to plant these different like charismatic and host plants and insect relationships into the park through this kind of implementation of what we call this pollinator shoreline. So we designed the shoreline with different plants that target that monarch butterfly to really create this like stopover along the Flyway that will hopefully attract all of the different species that use the flyway, but hopefully mostly the monarch. And actually I was on the site yesterday and I counted and I saw 5 monarch butterflies, and we haven't even planted the milkweed yet. So I know that they're there. But we've also introduced trees. It seems like such a simple concept, but it's so important, especially on this waterfront. And so we thought about all of the native oak species of this area and really looked at them as a keystone species for the site. And we're introducing over 1,000 trees onto the site and over 400 of them oaks. And so you can see just in terms of the kind of like supporting insect populations, the oak from Doug Tallamy is the plant genus that actually has the most butterfly and moth species supported. So these trees for this site, they both provide habitat and they also provide shade. So that kind of takes us back to the overall bird's eye view, or drone's eye view in this case. And thank you. Happy to take questions from the group. I think I hit right on my 40-minute mark too.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, let's give Brad a round of applause. That was great. I need to set up this mic really quickly. Somehow. You hear us all right?
Yeah.
No?
Oh, there's a lot of feedback from me though.
Okay. Oh, right. So we'll use this mic and then we'll mute out, which hopefully will take care of that. Does anyone have any questions at the moment? I'm happy to start off. Yeah, go ahead. If you stand up, you should be able, and just speak up, this should be able to get you.
Okay, so my question is, I was just curious, I don't know if you talked about it, I don't remember if you hit on it, but in your diagrams, I was just curious why you guys chose, like, I guess it depends what you chose. Did you have like an overpass over the road, or did you have like people walking across it? And what made you come to that decision?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So we studied a couple options there. And frankly, to just be honest, like sometimes budgets come into play. And so what we opted with for the pedestrian access from the bluff down to the park was creating that ADA accessible route. And then the other 2 access routes are stairs. And then we created and kind of implemented traffic calming techniques on the road itself. So introducing raised speed tables at the crosswalks, and then speed bumps and flashing signals in advance of that to warn cars of crossing pedestrians. So, you know, I think a bridge would have been really amazing, but just due to budget, we opted for the next safest alternative to get people down the bluff and across to the river.
Who else? I'll go. Oh, who? Chris?
Yeah.
Excellent.
I wanted to ask a question about Brad's career path. How has working at SCAPE either confirmed your expectations you had when you were in school about what it means to be a landscape designer, or how have things been different from what you expected in your professional practice?
That's a great question. One I wasn't necessarily expecting, but really excited to answer. So when I was kind of making the decision of what I wanted to do after grad school, I was really interested in the idea of a landscape architect's agency in the world to kind of advocate for work and kind of advocate for projects rather than being responsive or reactive to an RFP. And I think Kate's work and SCAPE's work really spoke to me in the way that, you know, she really thought about the oyster as this kind of like building block of the harbor, and used different like exhibitions like oyster texture to kind of grow that idea and then move it into a competition phase and kind of really make that scale up. So that was really, I think, inspiring to me. And it got me excited about my future career path. And then obviously I landed at SCAPE and got to work on the Living Breakwaters project right when it was starting. And so I was very fortunate to do that. And so I think in some ways that trajectory was really confirmed for me, but I think some of the things that I wasn't anticipating was, to just be frank, like how many emails you have to send as a landscape architect, and some of those like monotonous day-to-day things that you don't necessarily think you're going to be doing in school and find yourself doing in professional practice. I've learned that a big part of my job is communication and being able to really clearly speak to clients, really clearly articulate ideas, and through that articulation, building consensus around an idea. Because if you can't clearly communicate your idea, you can't get people on board.
Yeah, go for it, Mary Claire.
Okay, so in the junior studio, we're in a construction documents class and really talking about sustainability, and it's such a broad topic and it can mean a lot of different things and different phases of the project. So I was wondering what kind of led the choice to do precast concrete for the tide pool things, and if there was like a goal to balance materials that would degrade and benefit the ecosystem, or be there for a really long time, which like is a good and bad thing because you're like trying to keep it from flooding, but it can be invasive.
That's a great question. So what makes the Living Breakwaters unique are that they have to do three things. But when they're in the water, they have to do two, right? They have to be structurally sound and able to withstand the force of a hurricane wave. And they have to provide habitat. So the idea behind the selection of the precast units are that those actually can do both too, right? The precast concrete is structurally sound enough to function as an armor unit within the structure, which replaces one of the stones. So it's a one-to-one replacement. But the concrete itself has an admixture added to it called e-concrete. And that e-concrete changes the pH of the concrete and has different kind of additives to it that create more complexity on the concrete surface and give more, I guess, rugosity is the word, for things to grow on. And that change in the pH also makes it a friendlier environment for biogenic buildup. So the idea was, how can we take a stone and make it more of a habitat unit that can replace that stone in the structure, but function in that way. So that was the idea behind that, because if we had selected something that was able to degrade over time, then that would also degrade the structural stability of the breakwater, and then it wouldn't be able to withstand those hurricane waves. So it was kind of like, it was an ability to kind of balance those two things in that selection process.
Go for it.
As far as the living breakwaters go, that's over a relatively short distance, and I guess, what does it look like for you guys planning for, you know, the world as far as that goes? Like, is this kind of a test to see how well this works out and if you can do this in other areas, or I don't know, where do you move from there?
Yeah. No, that's a great question. So when you're working in New York City, and really kind of anywhere, it's some of the most challenging places to actually build new projects, is obviously for good reasons in the water, right? Because the aquatic environments are incredible habitats. We need to make sure that we're not displacing that habitat, and they need to be regulated, such that projects that are detrimental to the environment are very difficult to implement in the water. And so that was probably the biggest hurdle for the living breakwaters, was how do we get the regulators, the agencies, the Army Corps of Engineers, NOAA to get on board with this project, because it's new for them. Because typically when you would do a breakwater structure, which is not new infrastructure, you would need to provide mitigation. And what mitigation means is basically you have to pay to replace the habitat that you're displacing with your project, to like do wetland restoration or provide habitat somewhere else. But what we are trying to show with this project is that you can create mitigation in place, that what you put in the water can also be habitat. And in this case, especially with the living breakwaters, be more productive habitat, because right now it's just a kind of uniform sandy bottom or gravel bottom. And get them on board with that concept. And so really, to your question, what the living breakwaters are they're a pilot project of sorts of this new type of blue-green infrastructure that can serve as an example for other coastal communities in the world, across the nation, to start to think about these different and more creative approaches to coastal risk reduction projects and design. Are living breakwaters the right choice for every shoreline? No. I think what's important is that you have to kind of balance this desire to scale up, and also kind of understand the individual complexities of site, right? Not every shoreline is the same. They're not exposed to the same kind of wave climate environment. So breakwaters might not always be the right choice, but they will be the right choice for some shorelines. And so providing this as an example kind of like paves the way for more projects like this to be implemented and scale up.
Who else? Yeah, go for it. Just speak up.
Brad, what an amazingly accessible presentation of two highly complex projects. We are dealing with in our graduate studio this fall, trying to solve some of the mysteries of the disappearing lake in the Great Salt Lake in the basin. And my students desperately want me to find someone who can describe by example how you use ecosystem services. And since you just alluded to one of the features of ecosystem services, can you give us an example of how you use that process in your work?
In terms of use the idea of an ecosystem service to advocate for a project?
And get people to understand it.
Okay, got it. Yeah. Well, I actually think the most accessible ecosystem service or component of the Living Breakwaters project is the oyster, right? The oyster can essentially be created into a character that has this extraordinary ability to filter water, filter up to 50 gallons of water, right? And it cleans the harbor. And so when you're able to talk about, like, you know, people can readily connect with a polluted harbor and polluted water, right? And they can readily connect with this kind of like understandable creature. And what you're able to then tease out for people is say, well, okay, if we scaled this up, if we focused on large scale restoration, imagine how clean the harbor could be if we reintroduced just the oyster to this water body. So I think it's almost like scaling down to scale up a little bit. I think in my experience, when you start so kind of high level, I think people who aren't fluent in those types of conversations have a hard time grasping things that are really big and at a really high scale. And so if you're able to scale it down and kind of talk about something in tangible terms that I think people can connect with, I think that really helps tell the story. And then you can scale up from there. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you.
And it is interesting. We just had a comment from someone on Zoom that the sort of the single unit of an ecosystem service in the Great Salt Lake is the brine shrimp, which is so small that you can't see it, or with the naked eye practically. So sort of the opposite direction.
Right, but it's almost like draw the brine shrimp, right? Like reveal what the brine shrimp looks like, what the brine shrimp can do, and start to build a story around it.
Yeah. Any questions? Yeah, Craig.
Oh, Craig, I can't hear you. I might have to pass the microphone.
Craig Johnson, Todd's my brother. He's the smarter part of the family. Question I have for you, and it's incredibly impressive. Well, actually two. One is the role that landscape architects play in this incredibly complex system. What do you bring to the dance? And secondly, because of the one of a kind at this point project, do you have ongoing monitors and other ways of assessing the progress that this is making in terms of water quality, diversity within that rock structure, and hopefully it's funded, but I think that's the kind of thing that would add a really critical dimension, i.e. it's new, and guess what? They weren't BSing us, it really works.
Yeah.
To my two questions.
This is great questions. I'll start with answering the first one. So in living breakwater specifically in this case, and I don't know how familiar everyone is with like legal contracting terminology, but SCAPE was the prime. So what that means is we led. So it was our job to lead all of the disciplines, convene everybody together for design charrettes, kind of be able to understand enough everybody's individual expertise to make sure that they were all synthesized. So I would say in this case, we were the synthesizers as the designers and landscape architects. You know, admittedly, out of our element a little bit, right? At least at first, because I think traditionally landscape architects aren't used to working in the water, but SCAPE's trying to change that. And so I think through that process, like we got really like kind of familiar with coastal engineering terminology, like aquatic ecosystem terminology, and all that was through kind of functioning as the glue that held all of these disciplines together. So that was our role on living breakwater. So I think what landscape architects can bring to the dance is an ability to synthesize ideas and kind of maintain the story and maintain the concept throughout the design process. You know, we never let the habitat component go away. We never let that get value engineered out. We always kind of upheld the design targets for resilience and coastal risk reduction. So it was kind of like making sure that every point along the way that the integrity of the idea stays. And as for your question about monitoring, which is a really great one, and I think really important, and something that I really should have stressed in my presentation is, if you don't have that data to prove that your idea is indeed successful, you have no mechanism to advocate for projects like this in the future. So what we did, and it was part of the environmental impact assessment actually, was we had to write a monitoring plan. And so we worked with the ecologists to actually like embed experimental layouts. And what that means is that the system itself has designed controls, essentially, to then evaluate the effectiveness of the habitat installations on each of the breakwaters in a really simple way, so that data and performance data can be easily extracted. Essentially, we call it the experimental layout. So there's a monitoring plan. The state of New York will own and maintain this in perpetuity and will also participate in the monitoring. So in that way, the kind of funding is built in and necessary. It has to be monitored for a certain period of time as part of the agreements and the environmental impact statement.
Thank you. Keep on doing what you're doing. There's a whole lot more kind of dealing with these sort of things.
He said, thank you.
Okay.
Keep it up. I think we have time for one more. I'm gonna steal this one. Oh, do you want to?
We have time for two more.
Okay, we have time for two more. Look at that.
I was really impressed with the section of the park that surrounded the Tom Lee sculpture. I was curious, we're doing a project at the moment surrounding the site of the Shoshone Massacre, a Native American massacre site. Could you go a little further in depth on the things that you considered for how to surround that sculpture and while honoring the story of those that came before?
Yeah, well, in this case, it was a little complex because the monument itself was already in the park. It's in the park today, and our challenge was to design around it. So what we actually had to do was engage with the original artist and kind of share our idea, which was really not changing the integrity or kind of feel of the piece itself, but more creating a different environment in which it was situated, one that really kind of like focused you out onto the water and connected that piece to the river in a more kind of intentional way. But I think what a better answer to your question is how we approached the design with Theaster Gates. So in this case, Theaster was a new artist brought into the mix to kind of enhance that memorial, or I'm going to call it a memorial experience, because he uses this term monument, but he calls his piece a monument to listening. And so I think his idea is actually kind of rethinking what a monument does in a landscape. And in this case, he has created this space that's all about talking to each other and sharing stories and listening to the stories of others. And I think, you know, he's looking to kind of elevate the Tom Lee in all of us, right? That heroism in everybody, in the everyday person, and create this common ground for people to sit face to face with one another and talk. And so it's not, in this case, his piece isn't a statue. It's not an object in the landscape. It's occupiable space. It's space to move through. It's space to be in. And it's space to connect with people. And I hope I did his concept justice right now in describing that. If he were here, I hope he would agree. But you know, our role as the landscape architects to kind of support his idea, help him find a site for it, and kind of design the context to situate it into the park to give it that feel that I think the artist was looking for. I don't know if that answered your question perfectly, but that was the process in this case.
You know, I think we should end it there. That was a great response, and I'll save my question for the hangout after. Okay. I really appreciate it. Let's give Brad one more round of applause.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.